at a larger philosophical level, I think the lesson that we can take from the Jantar Mantars is that, and I think we spoke about this in our previous conversation, is that they were established after a great deal of research both into the kind of traditions that Jai Singh inherited, the astronomical, mathematical traditions, religious traditions that he inherited, but also those from other cultures, also those from other religions, also those from other regions. And he studied, or he encouraged his team, his collaborators, his advisors to study all of them. So I think that's a very important lesson, to not be insular. So and then finally, their entire purpose, apart from a specific practical purpose of taking accurate readings and updating the almanacs, was also to establish the connection between individuals and the cosmos.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of season 3 of podcast Books and Us. I'm Ranjit Monga. Today, we pick up from an earlier book and topic which we discussed in season 2, and the book is Jantar Mantar, Maharaja Sawai Jai Singh's Observatory in Delhi, written by conservation architect Anisha Shekhar Mukherji. The Jantar Mantar, as you may be knowing, some of you may be knowing, is a collection of monuments which together constitute a scientific astronomical observatory. These monuments were built in the early 18th century on the outskirts of what was known as Shahjahanabad in present-day New Delhi by Sawai Jai Singh, the ruler of Amber. And for centuries, the deeper purpose and architectural significance of these buildings were unknown. Till very recently, a lot of research was done, and the many layers of its meaning and the historical context of these buildings were researched, and they were brought out by various historians. And Anisha is one of them. Anisha, welcome back. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Ranjit. It's great to be back.
So, did you get any feedback on the episode 1 of Jantar Mantar?
Yes, I did, from various people, friends and colleagues, and professors, teachers, students. So some of my friends who had been to the Jantar Mantar, like Madhurima Mathur, she said that it made her re-look at it and re-understand it in a different way. Professor Sri Manjari and Radhika from Miranda House, they also thought it was a very fascinating talk, and it spurred an interest in the book for them. And Professor Snehangshu Mukherji also, he said that a lot of the concepts in the book came out more clearly in the conversation because it highlighted certain things. And in any case, I think a conversation is perhaps it's more accessible in many ways than a book. So thank you. I think it did help a lot for a lot of people to understand the Jantar Mantar, which is why I wrote the book in the first place.
I also got a lot of feedback. This author, Mariam Helawat, she says that she wants to know who were the people actually behind the construction of the Jantar Mantars. And I think we did mention that aspect, but today we are going to discuss that even more.
Sure.
Vinayak Rao says that the episode was gripping, and he heard the full 90 episodes without 90 minutes without a pause. As the author, he says, is articulate and passionate about her work, and that makes it music to the ears.
That's very kind of Vinayak. Thank you very much.
And he said that he found many interesting points which he did not know about. For example, that it was not a vanity project of an emperor, and that it was an attempt to popularize astronomy and bring it closer to people. And I think that is what you had been also trying to make a point, that the people at large should understand that that it is something more than just a heritage building.
Yes,
or buildings.
that's right. Yeah, because a lot of the writing on the Jantar Mantar for so many years was initially by British and European writers who were from a different culture, who couldn't understand a lot of what was there. And the other thing was that the Jantar Mantar, like a lot of our other historic monuments, has transformed a lot since its inception, so it's also not easy to figure out what it means, and it's also quite unique. So all of that makes it difficult to comprehend, and there are lots of there are lots of contradictions in the public domain about why it was made, who made it, all of that. So the book also tries to clarify those questions.
Yeah, we'll discuss about that aspect later on, but can you also just in the beginning take us through the various yantras or the buildings which are
Yeah.
there and their purpose and what they did?
Sure. So the Delhi Jantar Mantar today has about 6 structures, and they house different yantras. So there are two sets of structures which are complementary. The Ram Yantra, which is it's like a cylinder open to the sky, and there are two of them. The Jai Prakash Yantras, which are I can describe them as amphitheaters. They are like these concave circles that are scooped out of the earth, and again these are two of them. They are complementary. I'll explain a little more about that. And then there is a Samrat Yantra, which is the most important yantra of the observatory, which is a huge sundial. And with the Samrat Yantra, part of its structure contains another yantra called the Shasthamsa Yantra, which is a sextant, which cannot be accessed. It has not been entered into, at least for the last 100 years. And these 4 yantras are part of the initial establishment of the observatory. They date from the earliest period of this observatory complex. So the Mishra Yantra, which is the last yantra to be constructed in the observatory, it dates from about 30 years after the first few yantras, and it contains 5 instruments in its building. So these are the major yantras that are there at site. The Samrat Yantra, as I mentioned, is this huge. It's the largest and most impressive yantra at site, and it's an equinoctial sundial. So it's a sun clock essentially, and it was meant to measure time, apparent solar time, as well as the declination of the sun. So it was for 2 functions. The Shasthamsa Yantra, which is connected to it, was also meant to measure parameters and positions of the sun, zenith distance, altitude. And the Jai Prakash Yantra, which, as I mentioned, are these 2 spheres. They're these concave spheres which are set into the earth. So they're like these round basements open to sky. They were meant for measuring essentially space measurements, so the location of sun, stars, etc., both in the what is called the local coordinate system, which is the azimuth and altitude system, as well as the universal coordinate system. So that's supposed to be one of its unique qualities, and also to measure local solar time, but that was a secondary purpose. The Ram Yantra, which were these round cylindrical buildings which are open to sky, they were essentially meant for space measurements and local coordinates, altitude and azimuth. So that's as far as the existing original yantras from Jai Singh's time are concerned. And as I mentioned, the Mishra Yantra is a later instrument. It is supposed to be deduced that it's principally a demonstration instrument because it's much smaller than the others, and therefore the levels of accuracy that you can get from this instrument are lesser than what it is deduced that you can get from the bigger ones. And as I mentioned, it has 5 instruments within it. There is something called the Karka Rashi Valaya instrument. There's a Dakshinattara Bhitti instrument. There are the Niyat Chakras. There's also what is a Laghu Samrat. Laghu as in small, Samrat as in the sun dial. And there is something called the Agra Yantra. So all of these are in this one building. And interestingly, the Mishra Yantra, though it is not part of the original series of yantras, it has come to be associated most indelibly with the Delhi Jantar Mantar. So it generally forms the symbol for the Delhi Jantar Mantar, which is ironic because, as I mentioned, it is not part of the first few set of yantras, and it also did not therefore form the basis for the measurements of astronomy that were taken by Jai Singh and his team, which then formed the basis for the new sets of astronomical tables.
So I want to ask you about the construction techniques
Yes.
and then the uses of measuring time and space at that time. Because that part we missed out, the construction, and you have written quite well in your book about how, though the way they are constructed and the material and everything, uh, uh, those things make the buildings very unique. But all of them had a very practical and architectural significance.
Yes, so the thing is that at one level, it's in its intent, it's got a very direct practical function because though these are very large and they're as large as pieces of architecture, which is why we look at them also as architecture, essentially they were not meant to give shelter as we build a home or an office or a reception hall or whatever, or a palace. They were essentially meant as instruments, so they were meant for measurements of space and time. And the reason that they're so large is that the objective was to measure space and time as accurately as possible. Now, because they are instruments of astronomy, the challenge is to make them very precise because that will naturally affect your readings, right? So now the materials, if you look at the process of construction, the first thing is the materials. So the materials that are used are essentially local materials. So it's random, it's rubble or stone, local Delhi stone that's used. And there's a technique called random rubble, which basically means that you place the stones without necessarily cutting them to fit each other. And you fill up the spaces between the stone with mortar, with basically a material that will hold it together. In Jai Singh's time, lime mortar and lime plaster were used extensively for all sorts of buildings, and they have multiple benefits. And in fact, even today we would do well actually to utilize those rather than depend so heavily on cement mortar. So anyhow, so that's how they were used. So essentially you had stone, local stone, that was then set together in lime mortar. Lime has this very unique quality that when you're working in it, it's like a liquid, right? It's very fluid, and if you add, therefore you add certain components to either speed up or retard the rate that it sets, and you get then different sorts of lime. But it gives you a lot of workability, and it also has this quality that when it reacts with the air with time, it actually sets and becomes harder. So it's one of those materials that if it's constructed properly can actually become stronger with time. So essentially these are the two main materials that were used in constructing the observatory here, as well as in all of the others. So again, if you are in a different place, maybe it's not stone, it becomes brick, but lime is always used.
And I
That
think,
might come as a surprise because if you go to the Jaipur Jantar Mantar today, you'll see that a lot of the instruments are covered or clad in stone, whether it's white marble or red sandstone. And so that's, a lot of people think that that's what was there originally, and these have just decayed, and that's why they look like this. But that's not true. It was lime and stone, and there were good reasons for that. So unlike any other kind of building, because these are instruments, so you'll also notice that they're not decorated like other buildings of that time, either in terms of carved motifs or inlaid motifs or paintings. Essentially these are just the geometrical forms which are a response to their function. So for instance, if I was to give an example, the Samrat Yantra it's like a huge right angle triangle sitting inside a semicircle. Right? So it's sitting in the center of a semicircle, and there are these two quarter circles, and that's its geometry, which is very powerful, and it's something that all of us can experience when we go there. And it's kind of unadorned or unadulterated by anything else. There are certain openings that you can see within it, and again, that has a function, which is that it's such a huge, massive piece of masonry, and this, if you scoop out openings within it, makes it lighter. Also aids movement and passage through, because remember, though these are instruments, because they're so big, you need to climb up them, you need to access them, so you also need therefore ways of approaching them and going through them. And the other thing is that because they're so large, they also needed to be made in ways that was stable, and therefore if you'll notice, all the yantras, apart from the Mishra yantra, which is the smallest of them, they are made inside the earth. So there's a substantial portion of them that is it's sort of underground, right, which also helps in their stability. So all these are essentially innovations that were made because of the fact that these were being such huge instruments in the form of buildings in stone and mortar were being made for the first time, and therefore they had to be very careful and ensure that these stayed through time, which they have. So, and then we come back to the use of lime. Apart from lime being used as mortar to bind the stones together, lime is also used as a finishing material, right? So you finally you apply a plaster and a render in lime. And why that's important for these instruments is that finally, apart from their geometry, you need measurement, you need calibrations to measure off these.
So you need to mark them.
You need to mark them. Yeah. And therefore, you need to be able to inscribe those markings. And for instance, in the Samrat Yantra, the markings were subdivided very finely. To the extent that the smallest time division was 2 seconds. So you can imagine a huge dial of that size, and to then precisely divide it so that each of those small subdivisions is equally spaced. That would require both practice as well as a lot of dexterity. And in the event that you go wrong, because you can, human beings can go wrong, because it's a fluid material, because the lime is like, it's not stone that you make a marking and then if it's wrong, the piece of stone you have to chuck. Here you can actually redo it while it's setting. So it also had this advantage of the process being compatible with the function. And then finally, lime also has a protective function because, as I mentioned, it's like a liquid or let's say a viscous kind of material, and therefore when it sets, it'll have no joint as compared to, let's say, if you're using bits of stone. So every time, and stone is a discrete element, right? So you can achieve a circle through straight sections by breaking it up into small parts, and every time you have a joint between two stones, there's a possibility that with time water will come through that, and it'll affect the stability of the structure because damp will penetrate. So lime takes care of all of that beautifully. It takes care of the process of construction, it takes care of the function, and it takes care of future let's say weather resistance of the yantras.
You have also written about lime a lot in your other book, The Red Fort of Shahjahanabad.
Yes.
Where, lime has been used and in carvings and decorative materials, and it almost mimics marble in its finished look.
Yes. So basically, so you see, the skills were there. The skills of working in stone, in lime were there, and they were utilized for this purpose in a different expression. As you pointed out, in the Red Fort as well, there's a lot of lime that was used. The Divan-e-Aam, in fact, which we see today as an exposed red sandstone building, was covered in this shimmering white chunam, which rivaled marble, and a lot of European travelers thought it was marble. And similarly, even if you go to, let's say, the Lodi tombs today, you'll see incised patterns, very beautiful patterns in lime plaster. So there was this very high skill and knowledge of materials in India at that time, which was then utilized in different ways for different functions in different buildings. And even today in Rajasthan especially, you still have those skills alive, and I think it's up to us to ensure that we conserve those skills by giving patronage to those skilled craftspeople, and also including them wherever we can in the buildings we live in today.
We used to use them. I remember when we were small, when we used to get our houses whitewashed.
Yeah.
Lime used to be used a lot, but
yes. So whitewash is basically lime chuna. We still use it in our house because it's the healthiest It's much better than using distemper, plastic emulsion, all of that. It doesn't release toxins like a lot of these chemical formulations do, and it's also inexpensive, and it also helps to kind of disinfect the house. So, but that's lime wash, which is relatively easier to do. But as you mentioned, that's also disappearing. Lime plaster is a more skilled and a more time-consuming activity, which is also one of the reasons that we are all in such a hurry that we don't, we don't find it easy to patronize it or to use it. But it can give a very beautiful, tactile, smooth surface. So again, that's something that I'd like to very briefly digress about. How,
I know you are quite passionate about that and you've written about it. So,
yes, basically, my point is that, everyday living. Earlier building traditions made everyday living a beautiful experience and also healthy, not dangerous. And I think that's something also that we need to be aware of.
okay, so lime is one thing. I think it holds a lesson for us, for the future generations which
Yes.
came after Jantar Mantar. So, if you look at it architecturally and all these things which you described, so what lessons does it have for architecture or practical architecture now in the future? Does it have, or is it like a separate field by itself? Astronomy and that
Yeah.
architecture.
So while it's definitely, as I mentioned, it's not like standard architecture, because its primary purpose was not to give shelter, not to function as a place for living, and it had a specific specialized function. However, because the buildings were so big, the principles of architecture that you need to look out for in terms of stability, longevity, weather resistance, those principles apply, and we can learn a lot from them. I think what we can also learn from them is, we spoke about, I briefly mentioned this fact that they didn't use the systems of adornment that buildings did, contemporary buildings
Yeah.
of their time did. So most buildings of the time were utilized, carving, sculptures, paintings, inlay, all of that as part of the building, and that lent to the entire, let's say, effect as well as function of those buildings. Because when we stay in a house, if it's a pleasurable aesthetic effect, it adds to our experience of it. But the Jantar Mantar, it does not take recourse to any of that, and it didn't do that even when it was constructed. So it just relied on its basic, let's say, the forms of the instruments themselves. And in when we are taught modern architecture, there is this very famous kind of maxim which was enunciated by an American architect, called form follows function. And that was supposed to be a kind of break from earlier times, especially in Europe and the West, where very often what the building was meant for, its function, wasn't necessarily legible when you looked at it. It wasn't readable in its form. And when they kind of broke away from that, they enunciated this principle. But if you look at the Jantar Mantar, so many centuries ago, without saying it, that's what it's about. The form follows function. So it's a very, let's say, very honest kind of representation of what its function is. That's something that I think is something we can all think about and inculcate, whether we are architects or clients, about whether we want to to hide a lot of things, because yes, adornment and decoration, I think, are fundamental human needs, but sometimes people go overboard, and for instance, a lot of false ceilings, I feel, are they're not necessary. Sometimes they're also a problem, because they make it difficult for you to actually understand what the structure is going through in terms of how it's responding to the weather. So therefore, that's one lesson I think that we can take. The other lesson is really this entire notion of innovation, and how you can innovate while using existing bodies of skills and techniques. So as I mentioned, we had very skilled workers and deep knowledge of working with materials like stone, lime, brick, all of that. And though Sawai Jai Singh did not establish something that was reminiscent of other existing structures, he utilized those skills. It's not as if he broke away from those skills. So it's possible to innovate without necessarily breaking away from what exists before. So I think those are two very important lessons. At a larger philosophical level, I think the lesson that we can take from the Jantar Mantars is that, and I think we spoke about this in our previous conversation, is that they were established after a great deal of research both into the kind of traditions that Jai Singh inherited, the astronomical, mathematical traditions, religious traditions that he inherited, but also those from other cultures, also those from other religions, also those from other regions. And he studied, or he encouraged his team, his collaborators, his advisors to study all of them. So I think that's a very important lesson, to not be insular. So, finally, knowledge comes from everywhere and you should be open to it. And yes, how you utilize it has to be specific to your place and time and what you want to do. But I think we shouldn't be narrow about that. And that's what the Jantar Mantars, I think, exemplify very beautifully. And then finally, their entire purpose, apart from a specific practical purpose of taking accurate readings and updating the almanacs, was also to establish the connection between individuals and the cosmos. And that's something, even if you haven't read anything about the Jantar Mantar, and I think you just go there, you be there for some time, and if somebody explains how they work, then that's like the silver lining. But you get a sense of your place, and you get a sense of that interconnection very, very palpably, which is, I think, as I said, it reflects a philosophical point of view, which we may, I think, as if you look at the world today, so much strife and so much kind of everybody's retreating into themselves. So I think that's at a different level something that perhaps all of us can take away from the Jantar Mantars.
But have you ever looked at the whole complex spatially? Like you said that it was not about aesthetics, it was more or less practical. So if you look at it, because you go there and you look at each building one by one, you do get a sense of something very ethereal and something which seems to be put together, but in with a different kind of aesthetic. Say, for example, if it was now, it would be called modern art, So have you looked at it?
Yes, in fact, you see, in one of my talks, I mentioned this, that a lot of modern artists actually take inspiration from the forms of the Jantar Mantar. So Anish Kapoor, there was some years ago, he had done a show at the NGMA, and also in his other writings, etc., and talks, he's done these forms which are very reminiscent, and he says that the Jantar Mantar is something that inspired him. It's done that to various other people as well. When I said that it's very practical, I didn't mean that it was not.
No, I'm just sort of distinguish.
Yes, but it's a different sort of aesthetic. It's let's say very bold sense of aesthetics, right? Which depends essentially on the geometry of the forms. Now, you see, when we see things from our point in time, we naturally make connections with what we are familiar with, and so we think of it as modern art. However, we have to remember that this is about 300 odd years ago, so far, before what modern art came into being, more or less. And I think it was a very daring experiment. And spatially, again, I mentioned this in our last conversation as well, the way in which we approach, enter, and move through the site today is very different from the way it was entered, approached, and the way it was used when it was established. So we enter, its entire geometry actually of the site has been altered to fit into the plan of New Delhi as envisaged by Lutyens. And so therefore actually you are entering from the direction that you're not supposed to enter. You're entering from the back of the site, which again I think affects how we look at it. And also, as I surmise, initially you actually entered it from the Bhairav Mandir side, which was part of
the eastern side.
It was part of the site. It was part of a process of actually, because again, remember that astronomy was linked to religion at that time, and Jai Singh, though he was very open to all religions and all sorts of people, all sorts of advisors, from his Pandit Jagannath Samrat to other people from other religions, other texts from other regions, Greek, Arabic, all of that he used. And later on he also invited Jesuit priests from Chandanagar, etc. But he did follow certain rituals on a daily basis, and therefore it was also linked to that. But again, if you look at the temple, if you look at the Bhairav Mandir, and again it's been altered recently, it's been kind of covered over, but it doesn't necessarily fit your image of your standard image of a temple. So I think also what we have to realize is that perhaps there was far more experimentation happening then than we assume was happening at that time. Though of course within all of that, the Jantar Mantars are very, very unique, and they're very powerful. They're very powerful, and I think their sense of aesthetics is derived from the power of their geometry, the precision of those forms, and also the mystery, right? It's very intriguing to find these forms just sitting there, and so everybody kind of wonders what are they about. So I think the kind of aesthetic influence you said they have on you is a combination of all of these factors.
Why did you say powerful? Is it because of these aesthetics?
Well, one is the size, right? And then if you see, because you get they're very clean lines, right? So I mean, again, given the fact that they're all in a fairly, let's say, they're in a state which requires a great deal of work and maintenance. A lot of the surfaces are no longer, precise or even. But even then, the right angle is discernible as a right angle. The dials are discernible as these quarter circles. When you go into the Jai Prakash yantras, which are these, these concave hemispheres with these sections cut out, it's the scale. I think the scale is something that really communicates to you. And again, the kind of forms that are there, they're all derived from, let's say, concepts of the path of the sun, the ecliptic, the hour circles, and therefore how the sun moves in the sky, how the moon moves. All of those parts are kind of charted out, and they look very abstract, but they're actually part of the daily kind of dance of the cosmos. So
we did discuss about what were the practical uses at that time, because as you have written in your book that performing daily rituals and being aware of the changing seasons and the position of the sun and the moon and the planets, this was part of our society since the Vedas. And so these observatory, such an observatory was sort of made so that people or this king himself, Sawai Jai Singh, is able to calculate all of those. And then there was the festival calendar, the social calendar. So for that you needed the precise measurements. But there is another aspect which you have written about in your book, is this knowledge about astronomy, how it got carried from the Vedas time to Sawai Jai Singh's time, and in a very roundabout way, because a lot of it came from outside after having gone outside. So, and how it was preserved, and that Pandit Jagannath is like an example of, because you said that the Brahmin families who knew these had retreated into Mofussil areas after the Mughals and the invaders had come. So these families had preserved this knowledge, and then Sawai Jai Singh was able to bring that out through by using Jagannath, Pandit Jagannath, and building this.
So it's a huge span of time that to be covered in your question, and I have written about it, as you said in the book. But a couple of things. One is, yes, the oldest traditions in the Indian subcontinent, which are the Vedic traditions. Astronomy is a very important part of those traditions. In fact, it's, of the six Vedangs or the limbs of the Veds, astronomy is supposed to be the chief, and it's denoted as the eyes. And there is both a symbolic and a literal reason for that. So, Vedic astronomy was also observational astronomy, because the performance of Vedic rituals required certain precise timings to be followed, and the Vedic altars had to be made in certain precise geometrical forms, aligned to certain aligned to certain directions for various symbolic and practical reasons. So, therefore, this aspect of Indian astronomy being rooted in observational discipline is something that continues, right till Sawai Jai Singh's time. In fact, the term for an astronomer, one of the terms for an astronomer is nakshatra darsha, which is basically you're looking at the nakshatras. The nakshatras are, if you divide the observable sky to 27 parts, which is what the moon moves through in its cycle, that's a very important part of Indian astronomy. At the same time, the calculation aspect was also very important, because after the observation, how do you utilize those observations? How do you calculate, to predict, to plan, to build, all of that? So right from fire altars to temple orientations to even how palaces, towns, all of them were laid out, they depended a lot on correct orientation, correct, let's say, timings of laying foundation stones to inauguration, all of that. So Ganika is another term for an astronomer. So there's both this aspect of observation and this aspect of calculation, which is a very intrinsic part of Indian astronomy. Now, through the ages, this continues. Observations are continually made, calculations are made, they're corrected, because as you know, everything moves, even the stars, the so-called fixed stars, which is what the Indian system uses as its basis, as its reference, they also move in thousands of years. So tables have to be updated, and in fact the exercise that Sawai Jai Singh undertook of taking measurements to update the star tables is also part of a continuing system. So in that sense, it's a continuum. However, at the same time, what also happens is that this region there's been interchange with other regions through the centuries, and that also then gets reflected in the knowledge of astronomy that is within the subcontinent. That also goes out as you mentioned, and as I've written in the book, as has been, it's there in records. So for instance, during the time that a lot of Arabic and Asian influence, from West Asian influence, came in, and their knowledge of calculations, instruments, was also brought in. What is interesting is that I think there are about 16 zijs or handbooks that were used at that time, and 8 of them use Ujjain as the reference meridian, so indicating that at some point that reference was from here, and that continues. As far as the Mughals are concerned, many of them were actually, they supported the study of astronomy, and in fact, in the time of Akbar, the main subjects that are supposed to be studied, along with mathematics, physiology, history,
I know, and
all of that is there.
We even discussed that Humayun was a
Yes.
great observer.
He also had an interest in astronomy. The other thing is that, so 2 things are happening here. One is that we are talking about the dissemination of a tradition of observational and calculation based astronomy throughout the ages, throughout the subcontinent. The other thing that we are talking about is that when influences come in, whether they're invasions or they're trade or they're other kinds of interchanges, then in some cases, especially if it's religion based, since the Brahmins were custodians of this particular branch of knowledge especially, then they were threatened, and therefore they very often, they moved either to the mountains or to areas which were more secure, let's say. But the fact that somebody like Pandit Jagannath Samrat is, Sawai Jai Singh is able to to encounter him, to meet him in a village. And that's what the story goes, that when he was in the Deccan, he was part of the Mughal armies and he was going back, he met Pandit Jagannath Samraj in a village, and he was so impressed by his learning that he took him back to Amer with him, and then encouraged him to expand his area of knowledge. So the fact that even in a village you can have somebody of such learning, I think points to the fact that this is a science that is well disseminated and that's well rooted in the Indian subcontinent. And the reason I mention this is that a lot of writing, especially by the European and the British colonial writers, portrayed this time as the Dark Ages, when Sawai Jai Singh was ruling. And yes, it was a time of great tumult and change, but I think there was a lot of very active intellectual as well as social experimentation and interchange that was happening. So that's one thing that I think perhaps you were asking about Jagannath Samrat. And I don't know, maybe I've lost the thread of your question. What else was it that you were?
No. That's what I wanted to bring out. That how
Yeah.
it was very interesting that how the knowledge survived and was disseminated among people.
Yes.
Through folk tales,
Yeah.
through stories in the fairs.
Yes.
And this whole story about the nakshatras and Chandra marrying these 27 daughters.
Yeah. So so what's really interesting, I find, is that there are of course specialized areas of study, because if you want to really engage deeply in any subject, you need to have some amount of specialization. So which is why essentially, let's say it was the Brahmins with their knowledge of the Veds, etc., who also had knowledge of astronomy. But for instance, even Sawai Jai Singh, as a prince, these were subjects that were taught to him. So that's again interesting, that the detailed study is it's assigned to, let's say, one class of or one category of people, but general knowledge is there. The second thing is that, as you mentioned now, I've discovered this, that knowledge by itself or information by itself is not enough. How do you actually use it, or how do you connect it to people, right? So for instance, today everybody studies science. We'd all studied science in school and college to some extent, but how much of it do we remember in our daily life, right? And how much of it can we utilize in the way we live according to the seasons? So what I find really interesting about the indigenous Indian system is that while let's say the research and the new findings might be assigned to the specialist, the outcomes were disseminated so beautifully and so widely. So even a farmer would know, would know when to sow, when to reap, depending on how, as I said, festivals was one way to communicate that, okay, this festival has come, this is what you can do now, right? So Diwali is here, that means so many days after that there'll be, maybe Amavasya, then Kartik Purnima, and that indicates that a certain cycle of work can start. So in fact, I mentioned in the book also R.K. Narayan, the very famous author. He's written this book called My Days, which is like an autobiography, and he talks about his grandmother, and he says how his grandmother knew after the festival of Shivratri that 10 days after that she could start making her papads and buddies and drying them out, because then there would be no moisture in the air. So it's very interesting that and then there's a story of Daksha and Chandra to explain how this moon moves through 27 phases and how it waxes and wanes. Because on a daily basis, you may not want to know how exactly everything is arrived at.
Yeah,
you may just want to know what to do when.
Yeah, these are ways to tell people without
Absolutely. These are ways of communicating, right? And making them therefore live in certain ways that are beneficial to them and that are in consonance with the seasons. So the Indian system does that very well through folk songs, through stories, through customs, through festivals, and things that you're supposed to do at the onset of a certain festival, at the onset of a certain season. So and I think that's what is required, because finally you need to be able to live with your larger world.
Yeah, because Ayurveda also has Dincharya and Ritucharya, which means you are doing things according to the season.
Yes,
And it's
yes.
not ritualistic or just without any
Yeah,
sense. It has a lot of,
yes. It
this.
has a lot of science. Actually, you see, in fact, I think many rituals are just ways of making you follow a certain system, because if it's a ritual, then you'll think, oh, if I don't do it, something will go wrong, right? And you will do it. So it's a way of making people perhaps behave in a certain way. And what is required, and I think what happened concurrently, because in the book I also write about the fact that for instance, these myths were, again, they were questioned time and time again. So, Aryabhat says that, okay, this story of Rahu and Ketu, it actually indicates the ascending and descending nodes of the moon. So they ferret out the meaning again. But as far as normal people are concerned, for them it's something that you follow, because also, I may not have so much time and energy to delve into the whys of everything, unless that's my job or my profession. So it's a balance, I think, between making something a custom, because there is a certain sense in doing it, and of course it's important to question that custom every now and then, because maybe those circumstances are not relevant anymore. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, which is why therefore you need to come back to the first principles, which is what I think Jai Singh was trying to do with the establishment of the observatories. Because again, the what was happening was that the when you calculated based on previous sightings, what you calculated was coming really off from the actual event, and therefore they realized that, okay, it's time to recalibrate, time to reobserve, and again mark out what is the position. So you need to do that. You need to keep questioning whatever's a custom, whatever's a ritual, and see whether it makes sense or not.
So, do you have any evidence that ordinary people, were also a part of it? I mean, I know that once the officials or the king's officials have calculated and set out a calendar for the season and all, then the people will follow it. But do you see evidence of the observatory being directly connected with the people? Like, could anybody just come and also?
So, see, this is what he writes. This is
He
what
writes, okay.
is written in the preface to the Ziji Muhammad Chai, that this is why he devised, or he got them made in this way, so that ordinary people could come and use them. Now, the thing is that this particular, the Delhi Observatory, which is the first of the 5 observatories that he established, it actually did not function as an observatory for very long, for a couple of reasons. One is that Jai Singh was here from only till about 1721 to 24, and then he went back. He was made governor of other provinces, and then finally he went back to his own territory in Rajasthan, to Amer, and then established Jaipur. So he wasn't physically present here to either sort of encourage or supervise. But we do have evidence that even after he left, observations were taken at this observatory, because they invited, as I mentioned, they invited Jesuit priests from Chandanagar. They passed through Delhi on their way to Jaipur, and they took observations here as well. Then what happens is that at that time, again, the area of Shahjahanabad and the Delhi area is, it's very vulnerable at that time, because there are lots of attacks, internal and external, that are happening, and therefore the region by itself is not a safe region anymore. As we know, 1739, Nadir Shah comes, and he attacks Delhi, and then subsequently the Afghans come, etc. So it's a unsettled time. So therefore, I don't know whether it was used, because records are also difficult to find. So Jai Singh's own records are lost. A lot of them are lost, and records in the Delhi region as well, we do not have so many. And as I said, in any case, it was an uncertain time, so people may or may not have been secure enough or interested enough to do the kind of readings that he envisaged. But that was certainly his purpose. And then after that, the Delhi Observatory particularly was specifically looted by the Jats, who had a score to pay with Jai Singh. So very soon after that, the observatory actually fell into disuse. We do know that the Jaipur Jantar Mantar was part of the palace, so it was certainly used by the king himself and by his advisors. And also it is as you mentioned when you spoke about Ayurveda, etc. All these sciences are actually linked. You can't really separate them. So if you have a knowledge of Sanskrit, if you have a knowledge of algebra, geometry, very often that is um, to see that in action or to see that expressed, you use astronomy. So it could be that it was used for such purposes as well. I do know that, especially in the Jaipur Jantar Mantar, when I was working on the Delhi Jantar Mantar, and I had gone there to to do some research. So there was Pandit Sharma who was stationed there. He also told me that the local college, the local Sanskrit college, used to regularly have examinations where they would get the students there and get them to actually utilize those instruments. So so therefore we don't know whether it was actively used in the way that Jai Singh envisaged in his time, because of the fact that he was not in control of the circumstances very soon after the observatory was established. But we do know that it has been used intermittently by various kinds of people through the ages in different parts of the areas where he established the Jantar Mantars. And in fact, I think that is what we need to do really. This is what I've been advocating for the Delhi Jantar Mantar for a very long time, that we need to get them back and use them as instruments of science, instruments that explain to you things like spherical trigonometry, geography, latitudes, longitudes, ecliptic, all of these things which we all studied in school, but which are very difficult to understand because because these are three-dimensional concepts, and to understand them in a book is very different. So I think they can be certainly utilized in that way, not perhaps for purposes of astronomy, like cutting edge astronomy, because that operates at very, very different accuracies today. This is from a different time, when you use your eye, you use just the eye to actually align, and you didn't use any magnification, didn't use any telescopes. So it can be a very, very good teaching tool, I feel, for students, for anybody to understand concepts which are otherwise very abstract or very difficult to represent.
I think that is why we find, at least I used to find my geometry box very fascinating.
Yes.
And these are like a live geometry box.
Yes, and it's the geometry box, your protractor and your set square. They're like they're almost unidimensional, and they're very thin. And here they are large. They're larger than life, and they're sort of really substantial. So the Dakshinottara Bhitti instrument, in fact, which is there in the Mishra Yantra, it looks like a protractor. So it's very interesting. And Dr. Ratnashri, who was the late director of the Nehru Planetarium, she did a lot of outreach activities as part of the project, as part of the Jantar Mantar project. We had collaborated with her, with school children, the Amateur Astronomers Society of Delhi. They had also done, and it really clarifies. Things become very simple when you.
That's what I'm saying.
There, yeah.
It's like a giant geometry box in front of you, so you would learn better.
Much better, much better, because even if you look at latitude is actually, there's no real latitude. No, we've just figured this out as a way of understanding the earth, as a way of sort of dividing, measuring the earth, but there's no real latitude. And how do you actually then make sense of that? So when you're there, all these things, you understand that they're there for a certain purpose. They're a reference system, and they help to clarify so many things.
Okay, before we move on to the conservation part, which is also quite important to discuss, I just want to know that how did Pandit Jagannath and Sawai Jai Singh, how did they collaborate? How did the construction actually happen?
So the thing is that Pandit Jagannath Samrat is one of the main collaborators, not the only collaborator. One of the ones that we know, because he's written the Samrat Siddhant and the Yantra Prakara. So we have some kind of let's say reference or evidence, or his voice speaking to us through these writings that he's left behind. They would have, now it's a little. I'll have to first explain how construction was done, or let's say how I imagine or how I think it was done in that time vis-a-vis the way we construct today. So one of the important differences is that I think today there is a very specific division between somebody like me, for instance, who's trained in architecture and who's taught the theoretical aspects, who's taught to draw, represent, make plans, make drawings, and somebody who's constructing it on site, who's very often a mason who will have a great deal of skill and knowledge of the material, but who may not have training in, let's say, making drawings or perhaps the calculations, right? So there's a division that has happened with time. Earlier, while you did have, of course you did have systems of different responsibilities, different, let's say, hierarchies in the construction system, but essentially somebody who had let's say, who had the responsibility of designing or devising the overall plan would also have knowledge of how to build with their hands, and similarly somebody who built with their hands would also have some amount of academic theoretical knowledge. Now and there was something that was, as you know, there was this guild system where you had a body of different skills, trade skills, who operated as a unit, let's say, as a unit that worked within itself, and then also collaborated with other trade skills. Now, for the Jantar Mantar, so for general buildings during that time, because, as I said, a lot of knowledge was shared, though you had specific skills, and also you had certain conventions of building, right? So, for instance, if I wanted to get a house made, there was a certain existing image of a house or a certain way of living which was common to me and you, whether, whichever state of life or income we belong to. The scale might differ. So if I don't have so much money, maybe I'll make a smaller house, maybe I'll have one courtyard with some a smaller set of rooms and verandas, and maybe if you are richer, you'll have larger house, larger set of courtyards. But essentially the construction techniques, the ways of using and living were similar. Now in the Jantar Mantar, as I said, it's a big break. It's not a big break, but it's a big, it's a very different kind of building, right? So you cannot depend on conventions or precedents for that. So how do you, therefore, their question, how do you construct it? How do you actually make it? And I think in this case, therefore, there would have been a very close interaction between the astronomers and the masons and the stone workers, etc. Because a lot of the the stone workers and the masons can't look back at existing examples or existing conventions.
Because there's none.
There's none. So the lead has to come from the astronomers, who are people like Pandit Jagannath Samrat and others as well. And but it is still a collaboration because they don't know how to actually build with their hands. So I would imagine there would have been a lot of dialogue, and again the established way to make, let's say, newer sorts of buildings even within your existing typologies or conventions of palaces or houses would be that if you had a different kind of building that you were envisaging, you would have some sort of a drawing. You would not need as many drawings as we make these days, because these days we also make drawings as construction drawings, there are one set of drawings which are like sketch designs when we are thinking of how a space is and we're communicating with, let's say, you as a client. And then we also make presentation drawings, because how I read a drawing is very different from how a client will read. So how do you communicate to a client what a space will look like? But finally, when they have to be made, you make construction drawings, which is what will go out to the contractor, and that will be read by him and his workers. He'll communicate it to his workers or to structural engineers, all of that. Now that long process becomes much shorter in traditional indigenous ways of building, because, as I said, your mason actually carries a lot of stuff in his head, and a lot of detailed drawings don't need to be made. So what you essentially need to make, especially if making a new sort of building, is probably make a plan, probably make elevation. You don't necessarily need to make construction drawings and details, which also means that we have less records. from those times, because a lot of it was, done in the head, as opposed to, let's say, perhaps if, I designed a house for you and there will be a lot more drawings, and let's say somebody found them 50 years later, then you have that record. So we don't have records like that existing anymore. What we do have is some models. And again, that was a system followed earlier as well. If you had a new sort of building, after you kind of reached, the patron or the client and his designer or architect, whatever you like to call them, Mistri, they decided, or they came to an agreement, this is what we are going to make. To clarify the three-dimensional aspect, they'll probably make a model. This happens for the Red Fort. This ostensibly happens with Taj Mahal as well. And this happens for the instruments of the Jantar Mantar as well. So there are scale models that are made to actually see finally what it would look like in miniature, obviously, not it can't be to the complete scale. And the other thing is that in the book that Jagannath Samrat has left, he has given instructions about how you take a rope of this diameter and then you draw a circle, and then you excavate that amount, because remember, the geometry is so important here. In most indigenous buildings, notions of symmetry are very important because it's related to stability, but here there's another purpose, because you need precision since they're instruments of astronomy. So we have those kinds of let's say instructions laid out for us. We don't know who the masons were because there's no real record. Even in some other buildings, for instance, again in the Taj Mahal, it is said that there are masons' marks that were found on some of the some of the paving, etc., which a lot of that again gets changed with time, because remember, these are very old buildings. They've been conserved, they've been maintained, they've been replaced with time. So we don't really have any records on site, and we don't have any records that are there, because, as I said, in terms of textual records, because, as I said, even if they were, a lot of Jai Singh's own library was lost and destroyed, and the site itself has been refashioned and worked upon so much, both, as I said, because it was the object of pillage and concerted kind of attacks, and then later on in subsequent conservation work, some of which were initially done with the British, who again they changed things depending on what they thought was right. So a lot of these sites have changed tremendously, so we don't really have evidence of that. And there are some stray references about who could have been the possible let's say person who devised it all, but then again there are contradictions. Some people say no, so there's no unanimity about it. But what we do know is that there would definitely have been a team of people comprising of master masons, of astronomers, of stone workers, of lime plasterers, of mathematicians and engineers. So it would have been a multidisciplinary team in that sense. But yes, the astronomers would have perhaps led the way in this particular instance, because that was the objective of this set of buildings or instruments.
Yeah, and they would have been very creative, because to figure out the observation part, that you are looking at the edge of a wall and through which you will see the sun or the moon, to figure all this out and to put it together, and then
and to be doing it for the first time. Even if you have to make a model of this, it's very difficult. Even when we have the kind of, we have the original in front of us. So to be doing it for the first time, and also make sure that it's constructionally stable, which is where the mason skills come into play. So all of that, imagining it, conceiving it, imagining it, and then putting it into actual, action, and then making sure that it's not something that collapses in a day, but lasts so much. So it's really very, very creative, as you said.
The Ram Yantra, the two Ram Yantras, and how they are complementary buildings.
Yes.
So to figure that out, somebody very cerebral has.
And both the Jai Prakash and the Ram Yantra don't have any precedence anywhere, even in our culture or elsewhere. Like the Samrat Yantra, the scale was much larger, but there have been equinoctial sundials, smaller ones in metal, etc. So here, the let's say the innovation in the Samrat is of scale, but the innovation in the Jai Prakash and the Ram Yantra is of the entire principle of the yantra itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so they are very, very, they're very unique, and both in their time and even in ours.
We did talk about Sawai Jai Singh a little bit last time, and how how much interest he had in astronomy, and that he was an able administrator. He built Jaipur, and that Jaipur had come up as a hub for trade and even knowledge, because in the later Mughals time, when the Mughals were declining, a lot of these people, they congregated in Jaipur for all this. So today I'm going to ask you that, looking at all this, where do you think Sawai Jai Singh was headed? Do you get an idea of where he could end up?
Um, well, I suppose he's ended up, one thing he's ended up is as a conversation, but I know what you mean. So, I think, well, if he hadn't passed away when he did, because he passed away relatively young, he may have done a great deal more. But I think he was eminently practical as well, because as you mentioned and as we discussed in our last conversation, he, apart from his interest in astronomy, which he followed through, despite being very active militarily, as a representative or as a of the Mughal emperors, despite consolidating his own kingdom, which had dwindled to a really, he'd actually lost it, and then he built that up, and despite his interests in town planning, so he did all of that. And I suppose we can judge, there are two ways of judging what people are and what they could be. One is what other people say about them, and the other is what they do. So in his own time, he is, he's given this string of very exalted titles by the Mughal emperors, and
Sawai was one of the titles.
Sawai was one of them, but later on he's called Maharaja Dhiraj and all of that, and even his political rivals, they say that he's very astute, and the emperor of Delhi listens to him and to no one else. So he was very, I think he was not just, he had a lot of courage, and which was, it's also in the Mughal histories, it's recorded how as a very young boy, when he was fighting for the Mughals in the Deccan, his prowess there. But apart from that, I think he had a lot of diplomatic skills. So he could he could kind of figure out how to get along, or to how to balance different interests, which was also something that was required at that time, because there was so much that was happening. And I think he's very, very foresighted, because to do all of that, to pursue your individual interests and your own, let's say, intellectual interests, and at the same time to not let that get in the way of your basic duty or function, which as a ruler is to ensure that your people are prosperous and they're safe. He did that. He established Jaipur as a center of trade. He actually gave a lot of incentives, so people came from different areas. I think there are several things that actually we can learn from him even today, about how do you, of course people are complex, and there are sides of him which would be perhaps contradictory to some extent, but as a whole, if you see his persona, you see that he has a larger interest at heart, and he works for harmony. I think that's very important. Whether it's harmony, so we have, he's trying to remove differences between different segments of people, whether from the same caste or different castes, different religions. He's basically, I think he recognizes that if you live together if you cooperate and if you collaborate, it's a win-win situation. So I think that's such an important lesson to learn. And had he continued, perhaps we would have had more of that. We may have had more Jantar Mantars, who knows. But I think it would have sort of given us something, somebody to look up to for a longer time. And again, what's very interesting is that he has been portrayed as somebody who's willful. So the Jantar Mantars have been portrayed as an object of whimsy, or something that didn't have any purpose. And I think that came from the biases and prejudices of those who were looking at the Jantar Mantars at that time, because at one point it was not believed that any pioneering science can come from anywhere that's non-European. So I think he debunked that in his time, and that's an important thing to remember. And I think perhaps the most important thing to remember is the rigor with which he followed things through. So, he, of course, he didn't build the observatory. He established it. He initiated it. He gave funds for it. He gave land for it. He represented to the Mughal emperor that we need to do this. So he provided the circumstances and the situations necessary for the observatory. He obviously didn't build it with his own hands, even though he was deeply interested and he had great knowledge of astronomy at a personal level. So again, I think that points to how if you have supportive people in governance, they can allow so much creativity to come to the fore. They can be catalysts, basically. So I think that's how I see him, as a catalyst, and as somebody who could actually make things happen, which were not just for his personal name or glory, but for people beyond himself.
Yeah, and as you said that he built up something which he had personal interest in.
Yes.
And I would go a step further and say that he converted it into a huge legacy.
Yes,
and
that's
for the benefit of people for generations.
That's very true. And what you said is so important, and it's for us to actually use it as a legacy. So to do that, the first thing is, and if you allow me, I'll move on to what I think should be done in terms of conservation. Yes. So now the thing is that if you look at the yantras, there are three main aspects of them. One is their forms themselves, right? The masonry structures themselves and the geometry. The second is how this geometry was finished. That means what was the what for instance, I talked about lime plaster and lime render. So how precisely then it was let's say plastered and calibrated. So the second aspect are the measurements on this geometry itself, the calibrations. And the third aspect is certain elements which were needed with this. So for instance, there were cross wires on the Jai Prakash, which met at the center, and from whose shadow then you read various readings. Now today what has happened is that all these three elements are in jeopardy. Why? Because the basic geometry of the yantras has been it's been changed, it's been interfered with, and in some cases, for instance, and that's also come, I think, because I mentioned that the original team of people who worked on the Jantar Mantar were both astronomers as well as masons, as well as informed clients, skilled workers. What has happened, for instance, in the Samrat Yantra, which is, as we know, a sundial, and for that the dials are important on which the shadow of the gnomon or the triangular part falls. Now, part of the dials are not accessible anymore because they've been covered over. They've
gone under the ground.
They're under the ground. So basically what happened was, at some point, water was seeping into the into the basement area, into the underground area of the yantra, and to deal with that they simply covered the tiles. Now that might have seemed perhaps a solution to address water seepage, but in doing that you have actually destroyed more than half of the instrument, because you cannot actually read time from it, from about 9 o'clock in the morning to about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because the dial doesn't exist. And this was done, in a conservation exercise in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. Now, you can't do anything about it today, because, if you were to try to get the dials back, you might upset the entire stability of the structure. But that's a piece of, that should be a cautionary, let's say, tale for us. So whatever we do to the yantras, we do it with a great deal of forethought, and not just as a knee-jerk reaction. There are more than one ways of dealing with the problem, and covering over the dials need not have been the only solution. That's one. The second thing is that in terms of the original material that was used, as I mentioned, was lime. And both in the Jaipur Jantar Mantar as well as in the Delhi Jantar Mantar, that has been changed. So in the Delhi Jantar Mantar, for many of the instruments, they've used cement. They've used cement, or they've used cement-based paints. So what happens is that the precision of the instrument is lost. The edges are no longer smooth. There are cracks, and if you keep applying cement paints, then you don't have the precise ends to any of the measuring surfaces. And again, some of these they're irreversible changes. So there's a great deal of problem with that. In some cases, stone has been used. In fact, again, I've spoken about this at length, that stone has been advocated as it's seen as a more permanent material. But as I mentioned, it doesn't work for the yantras, because they're huge surfaces, they're curved surfaces, and you'll get multiple joints. And then the very purpose that you've put the stone for, which is to protect the yantra, it gets defeated, because the multiple joints will get water through into the yantra, and the water will make the masonry swell, get degraded, all of that. And another thing, apart from this, it also alters the proportions of the yantras. So remember, they're very precise. Their forms are still there. The forms and volumes are still there, but they were supposed to be very precise in terms of the measurements. If you're putting stone, you're actually altering the measurements, right? And again, then that will alter the precision. So from terms of function as well as in terms of durability, it is not advisable to put either stone, to clad them with either stone, or to put cement-based plasters, or to put cement-based paints. We should, wherever possible, go back to the original materials, which is lime. And in fact, as part of the Jantar Mantar project, when I was a conservation consultant, we had taken up the Mishra Yantra as a demonstration instrument as a pilot project for the entire conservation exercise that we were recommending, because in any case the Mishra Yantra was always a demonstration instrument, and it's a small instrument, so it's easier to do repairs to it. And we had recommended that you do different samples of lime plaster, and then we utilize whatever is most suitable. Also in terms of taking readings, taking shadow measurements, which is what the yantras are about. All the yantras are about taking shadow measurements. And Dr. Ratnashri had demonstrated that the best surface for that is an opaque white surface, which is what a lime plaster mimics best. Whereas if you have something like a stone like marble is a translucent material, it's got its own veins, and it makes shadow measurements difficult, which is what happens, for instance, in the Kapala Yantra if you go to the Jaipur Jantar Mantar. So it looks very, it looks really kind of well preserved and all of that, but actually in terms of the function, it interferes with the function that these yantras were for. So it doesn't even justify that. So therefore, my second piece of advice or recommendations would be to, as far as possible, get hold of patronized skills which are in lime mortar, lime plaster, which we still have sufficient of, especially in Rajasthan, and utilize those to both repair and bring back the instruments into use. And the third suggestion is with reference to missing elements. For instance, there are, as I mentioned, cross wires are missing in some cases. So even if you do if you repair the yantras perfectly, if you inscribe them perfectly, if you don't have the cross wires, what shadow will you measure? So you also need to do that. So it requires knowledge of astronomy, knowledge of building skills, which are which essentially are a continuation of what was used to make these instruments. And the last thing is, how do you treat the site? How do you landscape it? So when we were doing for the preliminary studies, we did a huge range of preliminary studies for the Mishra Yantar, right from plaster investigations in partnership with the ASI to excavations, spot excavations, to see what the foundation was like, what the plinth was like. And one of the things, and of course archival investigation in terms of records. So one of the things we discovered is that the current ground level is so much higher than the original plinth level of the instrument. When you do that, automatically you'll get water seeping into the structure, right? So very often landscape plans are made, or so-called beautification plans are made without investigating or knowing sufficiently in detail about what the original ground levels were about, or what the particular building, or in this case the instrument, needs. So therefore I would say that it's very, very important to, wherever possible, at least around the yantras, to make sure that you get the ground level below the plinth level. Don't make grass, which is what we do everywhere, which then soaks in more water. And so this is as far as the actual physical conservation of the yantras is concerned. As I mentioned, the biggest thing that we have to make, the biggest shift we have to make in our minds, is to stop seeing them as monuments and see them as instruments of science.
And change the perspective of people and the custodians.
And therefore the third thing is dissemination. And conversations like ours, the book that I wrote, and now there is, for a very long time we've been advocating that you have an interpretation center there, and I think finally that's going to be put in place. So all these are ways and means of communicating what this set of structures were about, what was their importance, what did they look like, how did they work, and therefore what should we be doing to them today, or doing with them today in partnership with them. So I think all of this needs to be looked at, which means a change at several levels in how we regard our heritage as such. It has to be an active living relationship. It can't be kind of frozen in time, and you go there, you click a photograph, and you say, okay, it was made then. You have to figure out what it means.
And it also means to include a wide variety of stakeholders.
Absolutely.
In the official conservation effort.
Absolutely. This is what, for instance, again, what we recommended. So during this time, for instance, I had worked very hard to get Dr. Ratnashree as part of our advisory committee, and I also said we need her as a modern astronomer. We need traditional astronomers as well, because they know a lot of the applications. For instance, Pandit Sharma actually demonstrated to me how there's this problem of the shadow, the penumbra, and when you don't get sharp shadows, and he actually demonstrated to me, you normally have a crosshair, which was a measuring kind of device, but he sort of yanked out a hair of his own, and he actually showed me how you can get precise shadow measurements. So we need to pool together. We need to take advantage of the fact that today we still have these various levels of knowledge with us, both modern astronomers, astrophysicists, as well as traditional astronomers and astrologers. We have skills of, let's say, workmanship, and we need to get all these together. I had also recommended that everybody on site, from the guards to the ASI staff, everybody be trained in how to use the instrument. So everybody is an expert and a guide. And when everybody knows something about it, it's very different from saying, okay, this is what it is. You know why it's important. You can explain to somebody else, and you carry that. Then nobody is going to vandalize. Nobody's going to deface, because you understand how important it is. And my favorite story is that when I used to hang around there, during the day taking measurements and readings, there was this group of people who came up to me, and they asked me what it was about. And it's not as if I'm an expert on the astronomy aspect of it, but I explained as best as I could. And as soon as they understood what it is, they called their children, who were till then running around the yantras. They said, no, don't do that. These are, you must not run on them. These are actually very, very important. They're measuring surfaces. Step back, look at them, don't run on them. So, so I think we kind of, we don't perhaps give enough credence to people. And if you explain, most people, there'll always be the odd man out, odd woman out, but most people, if you explain things to them, they will respect something that is worth respecting.
So, in the end, how would you sum up this legacy of Sawai Jai Singh?
Um, well, I think it's a reminder to us. It's kind of every time you pass by, it's a daily reminder to us of the fact that you can achieve something that is substantial, that is important, and that is beyond oneself if you have enough conviction of purpose. And even if you are in a situation that's tough, right? So he was in a very tough situation. He was often fairly young. He came to the throne, I think, when he was 12. His kingdom was taken away from him. All sorts of things. And so I think that's the legacy. That there is, it's a very positive legacy. There's so much that you can do, and you can look beyond yourself. I think that's what actually gets one to do things. That you don't just shrink your interest to just yourself, but you take your interests out into the world and you include everybody in it.
Do you also think it is an important monument or event in the, suppose the history of astronomy is written throughout the world?
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely. There's nothing
what
like it in the
place,
world.
what
There's nothing.
position does it?
Yes, there is nothing like it in the world in terms of these structures, for one. But I'm not just talking about the experiment of making them the forms. I'm also talking about this entire notion of being there and how it affects you, right? So, as I said, even in their really reduced state, they have this huge kind of influence on anybody who witnesses them. So, and as I said, as an experiment, again, it's something that has not been done then or since. It's definitely unique in the history of the world as well, and I think we need to recognize that without being parochial about it, because I think that's also the biggest kind of lesson from Jai Singh, that he wasn't parochial or insular. He didn't say, this is my science, this is your science, this is my tradition, this is your tradition. This is only because, I am heir to this particular kind of body of knowledge. He recognized that knowledge comes from everywhere and everybody should be allowed to use it. Everybody should be allowed to add to it, to interact with it. And I think increasingly today in the world, we are getting really, really we're getting into these little fiefdoms and about my history and your history, and I think it just doesn't make sense. So I think that's also what he shows, that finally everybody's part of this world. So the world is our history, and he shows you the connection to it, and that's something that we need to keep in mind and retain and communicate to whatever extent we can.
Yeah, I think one day there will be more research, and he will be put more in perspective in the world. This part of
Yes. Yeah.
astronomy. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think he wouldn't have bothered about that. I mean, this is my
Okay.
personal feeling. What he would have been more interested in is if these structures that he made, which are out in the open, these open air labs, if they're actually used as labs, not to keep people out, but to actually welcome people in. Because I don't think he was really looking for personal kind of. I mean, we remember him. But if that's, I think for him that was, I mean, this is my reading, but I think for him that was incidental. And I think that's true for anybody who does really important work.
That's what.
I
Yeah.
don't think they think about themselves at the center of the scheme of things or the center of attraction, because for them the work is that's more important. So I think that was what was important for him. His interest was so consuming in this, that is what he wanted to would have left behind, and I think that would be his legacy. Yes, of course, one would always like people to be given credit, and definitely he should be recognized for what he did, rather than being portrayed as someone who was just looking to make a statement of power. But I think, as I said, what is more important is the structures themselves. They were not large for the sake of being large, right? He was not it's not like making a large statue to himself or a symbolic kind of representation of his interests. They were large because they were required to be large. So, for instance, Professor V. N. Sharma has written that the samrats, the large samrats, the one at Delhi and Jaipur, are the largest that you can go. with naked eye observations, because after that, even if you have a very fine let's say calibration, the resolving power of the eye doesn't allow you to actually utilize it. Therefore, and that is, after that he didn't go larger than that, right? So I think the size is also, as I said, it's a reflection of the function. And they're not there just to be humongous and just to be sort of lording over the landscape. So again, that's why I think for him what would be important is the purpose with which these were made, and if they are used today for that purpose, if you can get school children, and not for sort of imagined constructs of science, but for actual understanding basic concepts of science, which are part of modern science as well, then I think it's really, really useful.
And also, as you said earlier, that for individuals and for people, one should go there. You really realize your place in the cosmos when
Yes.
you connect to the cosmos
Yes.
individually.
Yes. You look up and you figure out
Yeah, when you see
where
the
you
time
are.
moving and
Yes.
all these things.
Yes, so abstract notions, become like they're there in front of you. It's like a film moving in front of you. So it's like a sound and light show where
I would say it's a
yeah.
portal which opens for you.
I beg your pardon?
That it's a portal which opens in your consciousness. That
Yes,
you are
yes,
part of a
absolutely. Yes,
huge
absolutely.
universe.
Yes. So
Okay, so with that, we come to the end of this discussion on your book, and
thank you so much.
thank you so much for listening to the questions and replying so patiently across two
Well,
humongous
thank you so
episodes.
much for inviting me and for being interested enough in the Jantar Mantar to do a follow-up episode. And there's a lot that's in the book which I haven't managed to communicate or say, but I hope some of what the site is about and what the yantra is about and what its purpose was. I hope I've been able to communicate that, and the rest, of course, I hope everybody is able to go and experience it. And as I said, it will, there's both a sense of discovery and a sense of disappointment when you go there. Discovery because of what we discussed, disappointment because of the way it's kept. And I hope that with time, the sense of discovery will increase and the sense of disappointment will decrease. And it will be, kept in and maintained and restored functionally as we've discussed.
And I think that one of the issues which can be researched more is what you have also described about the our traditions of astronomy and how these stories got passed on and got converted into rituals. And I think it's a big topic for research,
Yeah.
and that what is the science behind all these rituals.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I think how this all gets reflected in your daily life.
Yeah, that's all.
How does the knowledge percolate into how you build, how you orient your buildings, how you conduct your daily sequence of activities. Because more and more we find there are so many, to get back to a real problem today, lifestyle diseases, and as well as a disconnection with the real world.
With nature. Yeah.
Nature and real world, time zones, people are unable to be in sync with the cycle of the sun and the moon, and it's a distancing, I think, and it's a shrinking of ourselves. So yes, I think there's a lot of research that's required into, I think, the basic practical aspects of all these sciences, because finally, that as I said, beyond individual intellectual satisfaction, how does what we study, how do we give it back to people?
Yes.
And I also feel that about research. I teach research methods in SPA, and one of the things that I keep telling my students is that whatever we do, how does it eventually help people? Otherwise, it's like an indulgent exercise for ourselves.
Yes.
And I think that is also very important. How do you link research that you do, the time, energy, resources that we are using, to benefit society at large, whatever profession we are in, whatever research we're doing. So, yes.
Okay, and hopefully there will be something else in the future, and maybe you will write another book and it'll give us
Yes,
an
I will.
opportunity.
I am in the process of. I
Okay.
will certainly, and I'll hope to have another conversation with you and your listeners.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ranjiv. It's
Okay.
very
Bye
kind of you.
bye.
Pleasure. Thank you.